each year for 20 years, or a total of $2 trillion. And then, at the end of the 20 years, the government will be asked to return the $1 trillion to the Federal Reserve. That means that the total cost of funding this $1 trillion deficit will be $2 trillion paid in interest plus the $1 trillion paid at the end of the 20 years for a total of $3 trillion. So in this example, the Federal Reserve makes a $2 trillion profit for loaning $1 trillion to the government, plus they get to use the $100 trillion that they created out of nothing again in another later loan to the government. Hey, Americans, that's not too shabby. Oh yes, there's one more thing. Notice that when our president and our congressmen and our senators talk about funding a deficit, they always fail to mention the amount of interest it will cost us taxpayers each year to borrow from the Federal Reserve. However, I'm just sure that's one little detail that they just forget about when they discuss this process. But I forgot one little insignificant detail. Now, I do not know for certain, but if the federal government loaned if the Federal Reserve loaned the federal government $1 trillion in cash that the government will deposit in the Federal Reserve Bank, I don't know that. But I do know this. The Federal Reserve has to pay the Treasury Department for the printing of any money. Marilyn Beaucevant discussed this in her February 8, 2009 column in Parade magazine. She was asked, what does it cost to print U.S. currency? And her answer was, a paper note costs 6.2 cents to print. Now let me explain what she just said. It costs 6.2 cents to print a $100 bill. The Federal Reserve loans the government the $100 bill at its face value, and it costs them 6.2 cents to print it. That is a profit of approximately $99.94 to loan the U.S. government $100. Hey, Americans, that's, once again, not too shabby. So let me summarize this whole subject of funding the national debt. When the U.S. government borrows the money from the Federal Reserve, it causes debt, meaning we have to pay the Federal Reserve back just like a private citizen does when they borrow money from a bank. It causes inflation when the Federal Reserve puts this new money into circulation. Excuse me. And it costs us in interest payments just like anyone has to pay when they borrow money. Now that doesn't sound like much of a bargain to me. This transaction causes debt, inflation, and interest payments. But there are at least three other ways to fund a deficit budget. The second way would be to borrow from the American people. This was one of the ways that President Franklin Roosevelt funded World War II. Hollywood actors and actresses like Joan Crawford went on national bond drives encouraging the American people to loan money to the government as a way to pay a part of the costs of the war. This method does cause debt, because the taxpayers have to pay the money back. It does not cause inflation because there's no increase in the amount of money in circulation. But it causes interest payments that the taxpayers have to pay the American people who loan the money to the government. The third way would be for the government to put the printing plates that print paper money on the printers and then just print the money. This method does not cause debt since nothing has been borrowed. But it does cause inflation because it increases the money supply. But it does save the taxpayers interest payments. And the fourth way would be to tax the people, declaring that if you want the services, you've got to pay for them. This method does not cause debt because nothing's borrowed. It does not cause inflation because it is not an increase in the money supply. And it does not cause interest payments because nothing's borrowed. So this is the table showing the four methods that are available to the U.S. government when it has a deficit budget. Now, which one is the worst way as far as the taxpayers are concerned to fund the deficit? Of course, it's number one, borrowing from the Federal Reserve. Notice once again, the government consistently chooses method number one, the worst possible way to fund a deficit, because it causes debt, inflation, and interest payments, yet our government consistently chooses this method. Now, which is the best way to fund a deficit budget as far as the taxpayers are concerned? It is, of course, method number four, because it does not cause debt, inflation, nor interest. But the government never chooses that method because tax increases are not popular. It might be of interest to provide you with the two presidents who were faced with spending problems and who reverted to printing money without borrowing it. One was President Abraham Lincoln, as we've discussed already, who during the Civil War had little constitutional taxing power to pay for the costs of that war. He issued a total of $450 million of what were called greenbacks, but they were not borrowed, they were just issued. In other words, he tried method number three. This caused inflation, but it did not cause debt nor interest payments. In 1983, Congressman Wright Patman, the chairman of the House Banking Committee, asked the Secretary of the Treasury to determine how much money was saved in interest payments by his issuing the greenback. The Secretary of the Treasury responded, "If the money had been borrowed for 100 years, from 1863 to 1962, to reduce the amount of annual payments, the amount of interest paid would have exceeded $49 billion. Lincoln printed $450 million in greenbacks, and the interest he saved was $49 billion. Thank you, Mr. President." The other president who issued money that was not borrowed but was just printed was John Kennedy, who in 1963 issued $43 billion of money not borrowed from the Federal Reserve. This is the Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan. When I was asked to speak in Dearborn several years ago, my host took me to the Ford Museum for the day, and I was truly fascinated by the items displayed there. Henry Ford, the car manufacturer, was a major collector of the past. One of those items on display is the rocking chair that President Lincoln was seated in when he was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. Those dark maroon areas on the back of the chair are the dried blood stains from the assassination. Just a few feet from this display is another one, this time the limousine that President John Kennedy was seated in when he was assassinated in 1963. Two presidents issued money that was not borrowed. Two presidents were assassinated. Now this is an interesting question. Is there a lesson for future presidents of the United States? I will let you answer that question. Let me bring you this part of this presentation to a close by repeating the warning given to America by President Thomas Jefferson. It is incumbent on every generation to pay its own debts as it goes, a principle which, if acted upon, would save one half of the wars of the world. Let me repeat this because there is an extremely important truth contained therein. It is incumbent on every generation to pay its own debts as it goes, a principle which, if acted upon, would save one half of the wars of the world. I am hoping that you grasp the enormous truth in what he just said. He was saying that if you want your government involved in perpetual wars, then allow them to borrow money from a central bank like the Federal Reserve. Now let me ask the next question. Has it been our history to be involved in wars all over the world since the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913? Yes, World War I, we got involved in 1917. Yes, World War II started in 1941 and it lasted approximately 4 years. Yes, Korea started in 1950 and lasted approximately 3 years. Yes, Vietnam, planned by our government. The war in Vietnam was planned by our government in at least 1945, but started 19 years later in 1964 and ended about 11 years later. I interrupt this discussion at this point because I would like to recommend that you consider watching my 4-hour DVD on the subject of the war in Vietnam. I've entitled it Vietnam, America's Betrayal and Treason. I believe it is the best explanation ever offered by anyone about the war and why our government planned it in at least 1945. You can watch it on YouTube on the internet. But let's go back to our study of wars. Yes, Afghanistan started in 2001, still being fought today. Yes, Iraq started in 2003, and of course it's still being fought. Yes, wars are costly, and one of the ways America funds them is through debt, inflation, and interest. And the owners of the Federal Reserve really enjoy loaning the money to fund them at interest. Now let me explain that while the Federal Reserve Bank has the name Federal in it, it's not owned by the government. Let me offer you 2 ways to prove that. The Federal Reserve has offices in 12 major cities: Boston, New York City, Philadelphia, Cleveland, Richmond, Virginia, Atlanta, Chicago, St. Louis, Minneapolis, Kansas City, Dallas, and San Francisco. I've been told that many public libraries have phone books from various cities around the United States. If your city has such a library, may I suggest that you visit it and look up the phone number for the Federal Reserve in that city. The first place to look is in the blue pages where the city, county, state, and federal agencies and departments are listed. You will find phone numbers in alphabetical order for the federal government, such as the Agricultural Department, the Army Department, the Defense Department, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and then the departments skip past where the Federal Reserve phone listing should be to the Food and Drug Administration. That obviously means that the Federal Reserve does not have telephones. But then, because you think that the Federal Reserve must have telephones, in exasperation, you flip to the white pages where the business phones are listed. And there you'll find it between the Federal Pest Control and the Federal Sign Company, both of which are privately owned businesses listed, of course, in the white pages. The Federal Reserve does have telephones. They're just not listed in the blue government pages in the phone directory. In other words, the bank is not federal. It's privately owned, just like any privately owned business with the word federal in its name. Now this is another way you can know that the Federal Reserve is not federally owned. This is a photocopy of an advertisement that appeared in the July 16, 1979 Computer World magazine. It's an ad soliciting applications from programmers for jobs in the San Francisco branch of the Federal Reserve System. The first paragraph says, "The Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. Some people still think we're a branch of the government. We're not. We're the bank's bank." However, there's one minor, insignificant difference between these three privately owned companies with the name Federal in their name. Yeah, you see, the Federal Reserve does not pay income taxes. But please don't tell that to the owners of the Federal Pest Control and the Federal Sign Company, because they do. And if they knew that the privately owned Federal Reserve paid no taxes, they might ask for the same waiver. You see, if the Federal Reserve paid income taxes, they would have to file an income tax form, and someone inside the IRS might just leak out how much of a profit they made. And the American people might get mad and put a stop to this. This is how Dr. Martin Larson, in his book entitled The Federal Reserve and Our Manipulated Dollar, added to our knowledge that this agency is not federal. The Federal Reserve is a private organization on which they receive tax-free dividends. It must pay postage just like any private corporation. Its employees are not on civil service, and its physical property held under private deeds is subject to local taxation. So if the federal government does not own the Federal Reserve, then who does? And the answer is very simple. We, the people, cannot find out. All we know is that the Federal Reserve has never been audited, and lists of its owners have never been released by the Federal Reserve nor provided by any governmental agency. Congressman Wright Patman introduced a bill which would have authorized a full and independent audit of the system by the Government Accounting Office. He reported, "I am frankly amazed by the massive lobbying campaign now underway to prevent enactment of this measure. This is further proof that a thorough and independent audit is an absolute necessity in the public interest." However, the bill was defeated. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't tell you one little story about the tenacity of Congressman Patman. The story is told that when he was sitting as chairman of the House Banking Committee in the early 1970s, the committee was questioning Arthur Burns, the chairman of the Federal Reserve. The congressman asked Mr. Burns this question: "Can you give me any reason why you should why you should not be in the penitentiary?" Well done, Congressman Patman. Congressman Ron Paul of Texas has been trying for years to get the Congress to audit the Federal Reserve so we can know who owns it and how much profit they make. But Congress has either voted down or ignored all attempts to do so. Dr. Carroll Quigley gave us several possible clues as to who might own it when he wrote this on page 52 of his book entitled Tragedy and Hope, published in 1966. These banking families include Baring, Lazard, Erlanger, Warburg, Schroeder, Seligman, the Spayers, Mirabad, Millay, Fold, and above all, Rothschild and Morgan. Of course, many historians have written about the last two family names, but I would dare say the others are unknown to the American people. It is not known officially that any of these banking families own the Federal Reserve or even a part of it, but some of them might have an interest. Dr. Quigley continued on page 52, "These families were almost equally devoted to secrecy and the secret use of financial influence in political life. These bankers came to be called international bankers." Let me bring this a little more into focus by this quotation from Thomas Jefferson. I sincerely believe that banking establishments are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. Already they have raised up a money aristocracy that has set the government at defiance. The issuing power should be taken from the banks and restored to the government to whom it belongs. However, all of these warnings that we've discussed have gone unheeded, and the Federal Reserve System caused the depressions of 1920 and 1929. They accomplished this by increasing and then decreasing the quantity of money in circulation, so that both depressions were a huge redistribution of wealth from the poor and middle class to the extremely rich. So why hasn't the federal government reined in the powers of the federal agency? They created it with an act of Congress in 1913. It is true that the President of the United States nominates the next Federal Reserve Chairman, and then the Senate votes to confirm the nomination. But other than this, the federal government has no control over its activities. And whereas the Senate has denied confirmation to certain Supreme Court nominees of various presidents, they've never refused a confirmation of the next Federal Reserve Chairman. In a primer on money, the Subcommittee on Domestic Finance of the Committee of Banking and Currency House Representatives of 1964 wrote this: although the Federal Reserve is a creature of Congress, the Federal Reserve is in practice independent of that body in its policy making. The Federal Reserve neither requires nor seeks the approval of any branch of government for its policies. The system itself decides what ends its policies are aimed at and then takes whatever action it sees fit to reach those ends. So there you have it, a brief explanation of many of the reasons this nation needs to abolish the Federal Reserve. And the way to accomplish this task is found in Webster's dictionary. The word is repudiate, defined as to refuse to acknowledge or to refuse to pay, to disclaim as debts. There's another word that has bearing on the point. It's called repudiation, and it is defined as the disowning of a debt. All America has to do is use the dictionary and repudiate the debt owed to the Federal Reserve. The government can simply repudiate the debt, which means the government says that we're no longer going to accept it as valid. Now, I'm certain that some are saying that an honorable nation would pay its debts. And I say yes, that is true. But please let me remind you of the words of Congressman McFadden. I charge them with the crime of having treasonably conspired against the people. Yes, the Federal Reserve is guilty of nearly 100 years of crimes against the American people. And the Federal Reserve should be abolished to prevent them from committing the same crimes again. And the quickest way would be to repudiate the debt. Let the private reserve go bankrupt. This is called justice. Justice. And may I suggest that you join with me in a one-man crusade and start calling the Federal Reserve what it is, and that is the private reserve whenever you discuss it, because that is exactly what it is. Perhaps this last thought by President Jefferson will summarize all that I've covered so far. This is what he wrote: if the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of currency, first by inflation and then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of their property until their children will wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. But in 1913, America did exactly that. We allowed private banks to control the issue of currency, and the process of depriving us of our property is underway. Now, I've got one last quote to offer you, but before I do, I would like to ask you a favor. If you agree with me that this presentation is a simple way to understand the private reserve, please help me by getting it a massive distribution. Please make copies and give them away. If you're a high school or college student, give one to every teacher or professor you have, even if they're not in the business college. Ask them to watch it, and then make certain you ask what they think of it. Ask your friends to watch it by giving them copies or by inviting them to your home to watch it together. Upload it onto the internet and then send links to everyone you know. I suggest that you send copies of this DVD to the opinion makers, such as your local television and radio stations, newspapers, corporation leaders, etc., because these people have access to people that most of us can never reach. Send a copy to your congressmen and senators, but ask their staff to watch it before they pass it on, and then ask them to ask their congressman or senator what they're going to do about the private reserve. If your city has an access cable station, make arrangements with them to show this, because quite simply this DVD can have a dramatic effect on the thinking of America. And all America will thank you for your efforts. Now, I would like to summarize all that I've covered so far with this last quotation from the writings of Will Durant, an American writer and historian, who wrote this: "Those who manage money manage all. Those who manage money manage all." I would like to draw this speech to a close with this hopefully amusing photograph that has made the rounds of the internet some time ago. It shows a hunter sleeping with his rifle in his lap and a deer sneaking in while he's asleep to eat his lunch. Please notice that the hunter is asleep. I'd like to use this photograph to illustrate a point. We are the sleeping hunter. And while we are sleeping, these international bankers that we've been discussing are secretly sneaking in to eat our lunch. And my admonition to you is this: it is time to wake up. Thank you so very much.